All right, so we've got this document someone sent us titled abandonobamacare.pdf.
Wow. Straight to the point, huh?
No kidding. Right. Calls for a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act.
I mean, Obamacare, as most folks know it.
Exactly. And it
Mhm.
really gets you thinking, has this act been the success it was meant to be?
Or, well, has it
Good
maybe
point.
caused more
Right.
problems?
Are we better off than before? Let's dive into this document and try to figure that out.
Sounds good to me. Let's see what they have to say.
So they don't waste any time. They jump right into what they see as the downsides, the unintended consequences of the ACA.
Okay, so like what specifically? Where do they start?
They break it down into, I guess you could say, three main buckets: jobs, insurance premiums, and how many Americans are uninsured.
Makes sense. Kind of the core issues at the heart of the healthcare debate.
Right. So let's take those one by one. Starting with jobs, they make this argument that the ACA's employer mandate, the one that says businesses with 50 or more employees have to provide health
Right.
insurance.
That one,
They say it's actually backfired and hurt both the employers and the employees.
interesting. So how do they support that claim?
Well, they point to a study by a couple of economists from the University of Pennsylvania,
Okay.
Gene Abraham and Ann Beeson Royalty.
Names I've heard before, yeah.
And their study highlights just how much pressure this mandate puts on businesses. It's like they're forced to choose between two bad options. Either they provide the insurance, which could be super expensive, or they face penalties for not doing it. It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, I see their point. It's like a catch-22.
And then the document brings up some pretty startling statistics from a MarketWatch article by Jacob Passy.
Okay.
And he found that between 2014 and 2016, somewhere between 28,000 and 50,000 businesses actually reduced their full-time employees.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah, just to stay under that 50-employee limit so they wouldn't have to deal with the mandate. And get this, he estimated that led to around 250,000 jobs lost. We're talking about 250,000 people.
That is a significant number. Makes you think, right? What are your thoughts on that? Could this mandate be, I don't know, causing more problems than it solves?
Yeah, it definitely raises concerns. The intention was to expand coverage, but if businesses are cutting jobs to avoid the mandate, then it kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Right. It's like, how do those people get health care then if they've lost their jobs? And not to mention the broader economic impacts of that many jobs disappearing. It's a ripple effect.
Absolutely. There are a lot of layers to consider. It's not as simple as it might seem on the surface.
All right, so we see how the ACA might be pushing some employers to make some really difficult choices. Let's move on to the next point they raise, this whole thing about rising premiums. The document argues that because of the ACA, people who already had health insurance are actually paying more now.
Huh. So it's not just about expanding coverage, it's also impacting those who are already insured.
Exactly. They cite an analysis from Investopedia, and the numbers show that premiums have gone up by 8.4% for folks who already had insurance before the ACA. 8.4%. That's not insignificant.
Yeah, and you got to remember, healthcare costs were already a big problem for a lot of Americans.
For sure. A lot of people were already struggling to afford coverage before the ACA came along.
So even an increase like that adds another burden. It's like adding weight to something that's already pretty heavy.
Right. It just adds to the financial strain that many people are already facing.
And the document points out this 8.4%, that's just the average across the entire country.
Oh, I bet it varies quite a bit depending on where you live.
Oh, absolutely. It's all over the map. Business Insider had this report where they looked at the increases state by state.
I'm guessing some states saw much bigger jumps than others.
Oh, yeah, huge differences. For example, they found that in Vermont, premiums went up by 23.17%.
Wow, over 20%.
Yeah, and Delaware wasn't much better. They were at 21.30%, and that was just between 2018 and 2019.
That's in just 1 year. Yikes, that's a big jump. Tough to keep up with that.
And it's not just about percentages, right? These are real people trying to make ends meet. The document gives this one example from the Heritage Foundation, and it's kind of heartbreaking, honestly. There was this 40-year-old guy in Ohio, and his premiums shot up by a whopping 159% over 5 years. Imagine getting hit with an increase like that.
Oh man, that's got to be devastating. It's like your whole budget gets thrown out the window.
Right. Talk about financial stress. So do you have any insights into what might have caused these premium hikes, especially for those who already had coverage? I mean, what gives?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the ACA's requirement that insurance companies can't deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, that was a big part of the law, right?
Yeah.
Protecting people who already had health issues.
Exactly. And it's a super important protection. But it also means that insurance companies are taking on more risk.
Because they can't pick and choose who they cover anymore.
Right. They have to cover everyone, regardless of their health history. And that can lead to higher costs for them.
And of course, those costs get passed on to us, the consumers, in the form of higher premiums.
It's kind of like a chain reaction. To cover the cost of insuring more people, they raise prices for everyone.
Makes sense. So are there any other things that might have contributed to these price increases?
Yeah, there's this whole concept of risk pools.
Risk pools. Okay, break that down for me.
So the ACA had this thing called the individual mandate, which basically said most people have to have health insurance or they got to pay a penalty.
Right. That was controversial.
Yeah, it was. But the idea behind it was to create these larger, more diverse risk pools. So you'd have more healthy people in the mix, which would theoretically balance out the costs for the insurance companies.
So it's like the healthier people offset the costs of the less healthy people.
Exactly. But if enough healthy people decided it was cheaper to just pay the penalty instead of buying insurance, it could have messed up those risk pools.
Ah, I see. So the insurance companies end up with a higher percentage of less healthy people to cover.
Exactly. And that can lead to, you guessed it, higher premiums for everyone who's still insured.
It's like a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And if one side gets too heavy, it throws the whole thing off.
Yeah, it's a complex system with a lot of moving parts. It's not always easy to predict how changes will play out in the real world.
It seems like there were some good intentions with the ACA, but maybe some unintended consequences as well.
For sure. It's important to look at both sides of the coin and understand the full picture.
Okay, so we've talked about job losses and rising premiums. Now let's get to this last point, which is honestly a bit ironic. The source is arguing that even though the ACA was supposed to expand coverage and get more people insured, it's actually led to more Americans being uninsured.
Wait, what? That doesn't seem right. I thought the whole point was to get more people covered.
That's what I thought too. It seems counterintuitive, right? But they cite some pretty compelling data from a CNBC article by Jasmine Kim, and she found that in 2017, there were 23.6 million Americans without insurance. But then, by 2018, that number jumped to 27.5 million. That's an increase from 7.9% of the population to 8.5%.
So not only are more people uninsured, but the percentage of the population without insurance is also growing.
Exactly. And it seems like young Americans were hit especially hard by this trend. The Kaiser Family Foundation reported that the uninsured rate among the non-elderly population went up by 500,000 people between 2017 and 2018.
That's a lot of young people suddenly finding themselves without coverage.
Yeah, it's a concerning trend.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on what might be driving this? Why are we seeing an increase in the uninsured despite the ACA's goals?
Well, based on what we've already talked about, it seems likely that those rising premiums are playing a role. If insurance is getting too expensive, especially for younger, healthier people who might feel less of an immediate need for coverage, they might decide to just go without it.
So they're choosing to risk it rather than pay those high premiums.
It's a gamble, for sure, but for some people, it might feel like the only option.
But then what happens when they get sick or have an accident? It seems like that could create even bigger problems down the road.
Absolutely. It raises questions about the long-term sustainability of the system. If the people it's designed to help can't afford to participate, it suggests there might be some fundamental flaws that need to be addressed.
Yeah, it's like a vicious cycle. Okay, so let's do a quick recap for our listener, because we've covered a lot of ground here. This abandoned Obamacare document has brought up three main points of concern: job losses because of that employer mandate, those rising premiums, and, ironically, an increase in the number of uninsured Americans. It definitely gives us some food for thought, although I'm curious to hear more about potential alternatives.
Yeah, that's a big question, right? What are the other options out there? If we abandon Obamacare, what do we replace it with?
Right, what's the next step? It's like saying, let's tear down this house, but not having a plan for where people are going to live or what to build in its place.
Exactly. You can't just leave people with nothing. So in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of those alternative approaches that are being discussed in the public discourse. We'll move beyond simply abandoning Obamacare and look at a wider range of possibilities.
Awesome. This is where things start to get really interesting. Listener, as we head into this next part of our conversation, we want to hear your thoughts. What are your reactions to the arguments presented in the abandoned Obamacare document? What stands out to you as particularly compelling or concerning? Keep those thoughts in mind as we delve deeper into this complex and critically important issue. It's kind of funny, right? This document goes on and on about all the problems with Obamacare, but it doesn't actually say what we should do instead.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to criticize, but coming up with solutions is a whole other ballgame.
It's like, okay, you've convinced me there are some issues here.
Yeah.
So what's the plan? What are we supposed to do about it?
Exactly. Where do we go from here? Luckily, there are a lot of smart people out there who've been thinking about these things for a long time, and there are some alternative approaches to healthcare reform that are being discussed.
Oh, good. Let's hear about those. What are some of the ideas that are floating around out there?
Well, one that comes up a lot is this idea of increasing competition in the healthcare market.
Competition. Like, how would that work?
Well, there are a couple of different ways it could play out. One idea is to allow insurance companies to sell plans across state lines.
Oh, interesting. So right now they can only sell within their own state.
Yep, that's right. But the thinking is that if they could compete with companies from all over the country, they'd have to offer lower prices and better benefits to attract customers.
Makes sense. It's like if you have more options to choose from, you're more likely to find a better deal.
Exactly. It's all about giving people more choice and making the market more dynamic.
So instead of having a limited number of insurers within each state, you'd have a whole bunch of companies competing for your business.
Right. And hopefully that competition would drive down prices and lead to more affordable health care for everyone.
Okay, I can see how that could work in theory. What are some of the other ideas for increasing competition?
Another one that's often talked about is promoting the use of health savings accounts, or HSAs for short.
HSAs, yeah, I've heard of those, but I'm not really sure how they work.
So basically, they're like special savings accounts that you can use to pay for medical expenses.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like setting aside money specifically for healthcare costs.
Exactly. And the money you put in is tax advantage, so that's a nice bonus.
So you save money on taxes, and you have a dedicated fund for medical bills. Sounds good so far.
Yeah, and they're usually paired with high deductible health insurance plans.
High deductible, meaning you pay more out of pocket before your insurance kicks in.
That's right. But you also have this HSA to help cover those costs.
I see. So it's kind of a trade-off. You pay more up front, but you potentially save money in the long run if you don't have a lot of medical expenses.
Exactly. And the idea is that it gives people more control over their healthcare spending.
Makes sense. Instead of just paying a premium and hoping for the best, you're actively managing your healthcare costs.
Right. And proponents of HSAs argue that this can actually help lower overall healthcare costs because people would be more careful about what care they seek if they're paying for it directly.
That's interesting. So it's kind of like the difference between going to the grocery store when you're paying with your own money versus using someone else's credit card.
Huh. That's a perfect analogy. You're definitely going to be more mindful of prices if you're the one footing the bill.
Okay, so we've talked about increasing competition with things like selling insurance across state lines and promoting HSAs. Those seem like pretty market-driven solutions. Are there any other approaches out there that take a different angle?
Definitely. One approach that's gotten a lot of attention lately, especially in the political sphere, is the idea of a single-payer healthcare system.
Ugh, single payer. I've heard that term thrown around a lot, sometimes called Medicare for all. But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it means or how it would work.
So, in a single-payer system, the government would be the one paying for all healthcare services.
Okay, so instead of having private insurance companies, everyone would be covered by the government.
Exactly. Everyone would be on one big, comprehensive plan. No more dealing with different insurance companies, different plans, different networks. It would theoretically be a lot simpler.
I can see the appeal in that, cutting through all the red tape and confusion. But what about the costs? Wouldn't that be incredibly expensive for the government?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. Supporters of single payer argue that it would actually be cheaper in the long run because it would eliminate a lot of the administrative costs associated with private insurance.
So less paperwork, less bureaucracy, lower overhead costs.
Right. And the government would also have a lot more bargaining power to negotiate lower drug prices with pharmaceutical companies.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like buying in bulk, you get a better deal. Yeah. So what's the catch? I mean, there's got to be a downside, right? Not everyone is on board with the idea of single-payer healthcare.
Well, like any major policy change, there are potential drawbacks that people are concerned about. Some of the main worries revolve around longer wait times for care, limited choice of doctors and treatments, and the higher taxes that would probably be needed to fund the system.
So potentially less choice and higher taxes. Those are definitely things people would be worried about.
Yeah, for sure. And there are also concerns about government bureaucracy and the potential for inefficiency.
It's like, on the one hand, you're trying to streamline the system, but on the other hand, you're introducing a whole new level of government involvement.
Exactly. It's a trade-off, and there's no easy answer. It really comes down to weighing priorities and making tough choices.
So it sounds like single payer has the potential to make healthcare more affordable and accessible for everyone. But it also comes with some potential downsides that need to be carefully considered.
Right. And it's important to remember that single-payer is just one model for universal health care. There are other countries that have universal health care without using a single-payer system. So there's not just one right way to do it.
Okay, so it's more about the goal of universal healthcare, and there are different paths to get there.
Exactly. It's about finding a system that works for everyone and provides affordable, quality care for all citizens.
So we've got market-based solutions like competition and HSAs, and we've got the more government-run approach of single payer. Are there any other alternatives out there that kind of fall somewhere in between those two extremes?
Yeah, there are a few other ideas that are being discussed. One is to expand existing government programs like Medicare or Medicaid.
Oh, okay. So instead of creating something entirely new, we just make the programs we already have bigger.
Right. The idea is to leverage the existing infrastructure and make those programs available to more people.
I see. And then there's also this thing I've heard about called a public option, right?
Yep, the public option. That one gets a lot of attention. Basically, it would be a government-run health insurance plan that would compete with private insurers in the marketplace.
So it's like having another insurance company in the mix, but this one is run by the government.
Exactly. It's meant to give consumers another choice and potentially put pressure on private insurers to keep their prices competitive.
Kind of like how having a generic brand at the store can force the name brand products to lower their prices.
That's a great analogy. It's all about creating a more level playing field and giving consumers more power.
Wow. So we've gone from abandon Obamacare to a whole buffet of alternative approaches. Market solutions, single payer, expanding existing programs, public options. It's a lot to take in.
It is. Healthcare is so complex, but that's why it's so important to have these conversations and explore all the different possibilities.
We have to weigh the pros and cons, think critically about the potential consequences, both intended and unintended.
And ultimately, it's about finding solutions that align with our values as a society. What kind of healthcare system do we want to have? What are our priorities?
Yeah, it's not just about the economics of it all. It's about people's lives, their health, their well-being. We have to remember that.
Exactly. It's about finding a way to provide quality, affordable healthcare for everyone, regardless of their income, their background, their health status.
It's a big challenge, but it's one we have to tackle together.
Absolutely. We need to have open and honest conversations, listen to different perspectives, and work collaboratively to find solutions that work for everyone.
All right, so we've explored some potential alternatives to the ACA, but we haven't really talked about how those alternatives would actually address the specific concerns raised in that abandoned Obamacare document.
Oh, you mean the job losses, rising premiums, and the increase in the uninsured? Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. It's not enough to just say, get rid of Obamacare. We need to think about how these other approaches would tackle those specific issues.
For sure. We need to evaluate whether these alternatives would actually make things better or if they might create a whole new set of problems.
It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, and we have all these different pieces, but we're not sure how they fit together.
That's a great way to put it. It's a complex puzzle, and moving one piece can have ripple effects throughout the whole system.
We have to be mindful of those ripple effects and think about the unintended consequences.
Exactly. We can't just focus on one aspect of the system without considering the broader implications. Healthcare is interconnected. It's all part of a larger ecosystem.
And it's an ecosystem that affects all of us. This is a really important conversation to be having.
I agree. And I think it's great that we're taking the time to explore these issues in depth.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, listener, we want to hear from you again. Which of these alternative approaches resonates most with you? What questions or concerns do you have about the potential benefits and drawbacks we've discussed? Keep those thoughts in mind as we head into the final part of our conversation, where we'll step back and reflect on everything we've learned and try to figure out what it all means for the future of healthcare in America.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. It's a lot to process.
Right, it really is. We started with that abandoned Obamacare document, which focused on the economic arguments.
Right, the job losses, the rising premiums.
And then we kind of went down the rabbit hole of alternative approaches.
Yeah, we explored market-based solutions, talked about single-payer healthcare, even touched on expanding existing programs and that public option idea. It feels like healthcare reform is this giant puzzle with a million pieces.
It's definitely complex, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
It seems like every option has its pros and cons. Exactly, and I think that's a really important takeaway from this deep dive. There's no magic bullet. Healthcare reform isn't just about finding the right policy.
It's about having those tough conversations and weighing different values and priorities.
Exactly. It's about figuring out what kind of society we want to be and how we're going to care for each other.
It makes you think about all those stories behind the statistics,
Yeah.
the real people who are affected by these policies.
Absolutely. The human cost of healthcare is something we can't afford to ignore.
So let's do a quick recap for our listeners, just to bring it all together.
Right.
We started with that document that argued for getting rid of Obamacare, highlighting some serious concerns.
Right. Concerns about job losses, rising costs for people who already had insurance, and that surprising increase in the number of uninsured Americans.
And then we shifted gears and explored a bunch of alternative approaches, from market-based solutions to a more government-run system. It's clear that there's no easy answer, no simple fix.
Healthcare is just too complex for that. It's a delicate ecosystem with all these interconnected parts.
And any changes we make are going to have ripple effects throughout the entire system.
Which is why it's so crucial to have these discussions to weigh the potential consequences, both intended and unintended.
We have to approach this issue with open minds, listen to different perspectives, and be willing to compromise.
Absolutely. Healthcare is ultimately about people. It's about ensuring that everyone has access to quality, affordable care.
It's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just a select few.
And that's a goal worth striving for.
Well said. Listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this incredibly important and complex issue. We've explored a lot of information, tackled some tough questions, and hopefully sparked some thoughtful reflection.
If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all, that's totally understandable. Healthcare is a massive topic.
But it's also a topic that affects every single one of us.
So, as you continue to learn and engage in these...
Think about the real people who are impacted by these policy decisions, their struggles, their hopes, their dreams.
Healthcare is about so much more than just numbers and statistics. It's about people's lives, their well-being, their ability to thrive.
And ultimately, it's about our shared responsibility to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to live a healthy and fulfilling life.
That's a beautiful sentiment, and it's a powerful reminder of what's at stake in this ongoing debate.
Listener, we encourage you to stay informed, engage in thoughtful dialogue, and advocate for solutions that align with your values. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of healthcare reform. We'll see you next time.